The fluorescent lights hummed overhead at Cedar Creek Medical, that particular frequency that only hospital staff ever truly heard, a sound so constant it became invisible, like breathing. Hannah Clarke's hands moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before, her charting meticulous, each note documented with the care of someone who understood that words on a screen could mean the difference between a patient's survival and a lawsuit 3 years down the line. 3 years she'd been here. 3 years of night shifts bleeding into day shifts, of holding the line when residents froze, of catching what others missed because she'd learned long ago that attention to detail wasn't a luxury, it was survival. The ICU at Cedar Creek ran on rhythm. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical breath. Monitors beeped in staggered patterns, each one a different heartbeat, a different story, a different person fighting their way back to the world. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something underneath it, something like copper and sweat and the particular staleness of recirculated air in a building designed to keep the outside world out. Hannah moved through the unit like water, efficient and unremarkable. No one noticed her. That was the point. That was always the point. She wore her scrubs like armor. Teal-colored, pockets deep enough to hold everything, trauma shears, penlight, the small leather-bound notebook where she kept notes that went deeper than the official record. And sewn into the interior of her scrub jacket, so faded it was almost invisible unless you knew to look, was a patch. The 75th Ranger Regiment insignia. Frayed at the edges. Threadbare in places. But still there. Still hers. She touched it sometimes when no one was watching, a ghost of a habit from another life that had officially stopped existing 8 years ago. The morning of grand rounds came in grey. Dr. Marcus Mercer swept into the ICU like a man accustomed to rooms parting for him, his white coat pristine, his tie the colour of old money, his presence carrying the weight of someone who'd never been told no and never wanted to be. He moved to the central station where Hannah was finishing documentation on a post-op trauma admission, and without preamble, he lifted her chart. She knew what was coming before his mouth opened. She'd been the example 3 times before. Ms. Clarke's assessment here, Mercer announced to the cluster of residents trailing behind him like ducklings, his voice pitched to carry across the unit. He held the chart up, the motion deliberate, theatrical. 4:15 a.m. Patient admitted post-op bowel resection. Ms. Clarke notes here, he paused, his eyebrow arched in that particular way that made everyone around him uncomfortable, subtle abdominal distension, non-pharmacological pain response, recommend imaging for possible leak. Non-standard terminology. Questionable clinical judgment. Hannah continued typing. Her hands didn't hesitate. Her breath stayed even. One wonders, Mercer continued, turning slightly so his audience could see his expression, whether perhaps you might have considered actual nursing school. You know, the kind with accreditation. Credentials. The residents laughed, that specific nervous laugh that meant they knew better but also knew which way the wind was blowing. Mercer turned the page. The imaging was ordered 6 hours later by myself. Anastomotic leak confirmed. Ms. Clarke's timeline cost us 6 hours and likely cost the patient several units of blood product we could have avoided. What he didn't say was that the patient survived. What he didn't mention was that Hannah's instinct to flag it early was the only reason surgery had caught the complication before sepsis. What he carefully left out was the email she'd sent him at 4:32 a.m., for minutes after her note, escalating her concern. But those details didn't fit the narrative he was constructing. Hannah closed her documentation and met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked back at the monitor. The chart left her hands. The rounds moved on. She was already thinking about the next patient, a 62-year-old with a pneumothorax that needed watching, when Mercer's voice came back, quieter but somehow louder. Perhaps we can all learn something from this. The importance of staying within scope of practice. The vending machine was in the break room on the 2nd floor, fluorescent light reflecting off glass doors full of things that claimed to be food. Hannah fed $2 into the mechanism at 2:13 p.m., waiting for the mechanical where that meant her coffee was coming. The break room was supposed to be empty on Tuesdays at this hour. She'd timed it that way for 3 years. But today Sarah and Jenna were there, clustered by the microwave, their voices dropping as she walked in but not far enough. "I'm telling you, her charting is all wrong," Sarah was saying. Jenna, who'd grabbed coffee with Hannah last month and talked about her kids' soccer schedules, was nodding. "I heard she never actually finished nursing school. Like, she just got credentialed somehow." "Shortcuts," Jenna said. Sarah leaned in closer. "Probably faked the whole thing." Hannah's coffee dropped into the bin below. She retrieved it without looking at them. The cup was hot in her hand, warm enough to hurt, and she considered for a moment letting that be the only feeling she felt. But her hands, those hands that had held other people's lives together in sandstorms and worse, stayed steady. She turned and walked past both of them to the door. Sarah was still talking. Neither of them had bothered to check if the person they were discussing could hear them. The emergency department came alive at 4:57 p.m. Ambulance arrived, no call ahead, just the door slamming open and a stretcher moving fast, paramedics calling out vitals in that clipped cadence that meant trouble. Hannah was already moving, her shift not officially over for 13 minutes but her body responding to urgency the way it always did. The patient was unresponsive. Male, appeared to be mid-50s, no wallet on him, no identification, no medical alert bracelet. Just a body that had taken damage. Paramedics were calling out their report, found unresponsive, possible fall, multiple contusions, BP systolic running 84, when Hannah saw it. Small chain around his neck. Metal catching the light. Dog tags. She moved closer without permission, reading the inscription while the ED physician ordered imaging and blood work. The lettering was military neat, stamped with precision. SGT Ramos, Army Ranger. Something shifted in her chest. She continued moving, checking pupils, starting in 4, running through the assessment with the part of her brain that had been trained for exactly this, but her hands knew something her conscious mind was still processing. When they moved him to get him undressed and cleaned up, she was the one handling his jacket. The paramedics had cut the sleeve away but the jacket itself was still intact, and that's when she saw it. A patch. Faded nearly to invisibility. 75th Ranger Regiment. She'd know it anywhere. She found herself cleaning his arm in the trauma bay, washing away blood that had dried dark and thick, revealing the skin underneath. Her hands trembled once, just once, a single involuntary flex of muscles that had learned not to show fear, because there, in block letters that had aged like old scar tissue, was her name. Hannah. Just that. Just her first name, tattooed in what looked like old ink, the kind of ink you got in a place where sterile technique was theoretical and survival was actual. Kandahar. That's where this came from. That's where Sergeant Ramos was from. That's where she'd carried him, after the operation went sideways. After 3 senators demanded it be buried. After the colonel looked her in the eye and told her that Captain Hannah Clarke was being erased, that her service record would be classified so thoroughly it would be as if she'd never existed, that if she ever surfaced again, if she ever told anyone what actually happened in that valley, there would be consequences. She'd spent 8 years becoming invisible. Now here was Ramos, the man whose name she'd carried through fire, lying unconscious with her name written on his body in permanent ink. His vacant eye stared at nothing. No recognition. No memory of a captain who dragged him to the evac bird under mortar fire, whose hands had been the last thing he felt before the rotor wash took him up and away. The monitor beside his stretcher beeped out his heart rate. Fast. Elevated. The O2 monitor registered 84% and dropping. His blood pressure was still circling downward, now reading 78/41. Everything was going wrong in that specific cascade of going wrong that meant they had maybe 15 minutes before this stopped being a recovery scenario and became a death. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Mercer appeared at her shoulder without warning, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, all weight and barely contained noise. His fingers drummed against the trauma bay counter, 3 quick taps that echoed against the tile. "Why are you wasting time on a vagrant?" His voice cut through the controlled chaos of the resuscitation, loud enough for the 2 residents and the respiratory tech to hear. "We have paying patients upstairs. This man has nothing. No insurance card. No identification. Nothing. Hannah's hands continued their work, checking the chest tube placement, verifying the line patency, reading the monitor with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She didn't look up. One measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. "The Pentagon is on line 2, she said quietly. "They're asking for his status." The words landed like a scalpel through silk. Clean. Final. Mercer's face darkened, actually darkened, the color draining and returning in a mottled flush that started at his collar. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The hand that had been drumming stopped mid-tap. "You're lying," he said. "Line 2. Ask the operator." A single tear escaped then, but Hannah's hand came up and wiped it away with the back of her fingers without breaking eye contact. The gesture wasn't weakness. It was something closer to contempt, the physical act of dismissing him while looking directly into his eyes. She turned back to her patient, to the man with her name tattooed in block letters on his arm, the man whose eyes were still vacant but whose chest was rising and falling with the ventilator's rhythm. "Perhaps," Hannah said, her voice descending into that devastating calm that made even the residents step back, "you'd like to tell them yourself why his chest tube was delayed." The silence that followed was so thick you could operate in it. Mercer left the trauma bay. He didn't walk, he moved with the jerking precision of someone whose strings had been cut and were now tangling. His jaw worked silently. His hands clenched and unclenched. He was back within the hour. Hannah was still in the ICU, completing post-intubation documentation, when the reassignment notification hit her email. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. Effective immediately. Night rotation. The scheduled rotations that meant 12-hour shifts between 11 at night and 7 in the morning, the graveyard detail, the shift where skeleton crews and skeleton support meant everything moved slower and help was further away. Then the call to the credentialing committee. The intercom crackled twice before she heard her name paged to the administrative office. Not unusual. Credentialing questions happened. But the tone in the operator's voice, that slight hesitation before the second page, told her something had shifted. She found Mercer in the hallway outside the credentials office, his phone still pressed to his ear. He was lowering it as she approached, and his expression was the smile of someone who had just placed a weapon on a table and was watching to see which way someone would dive. "I've just alerted the committee about some concerns," he said conversationally. "Questions about your certifications. Your background. You understand, we have to maintain standards. Patient safety is paramount." Hannah stood 3 feet away. Her heart rate hadn't changed. Her breathing was steady. The trembling that wanted to come, that electric surge of adrenaline recognizing threat, she locked it down so deep that only her hands knew it was there. "Of course, Doctor. Your access to the ICU is being temporarily suspended pending review. I'm sure you understand. Protocol." She nodded once. Didn't argue. Didn't defend. The moment you started explaining yourself to someone like Mercer, you'd already lost the ground beneath your feet. She'd learned that in Kandahar, in the after-action reviews where colonels asked why decisions had been made and you realized that justification was just another word for doubt. "I understand," Hannah said. What she understood was that Mercer had just made his first rail move. The verbal humiliation had been stage 1, the testing, the establishing of hierarchy, the public performance of dominance. But this was stage 2. This was strategic. This was the removal of her tools and her access, the slow isolation that made you smaller and smaller until you disappeared altogether. She'd been trying to disappear her whole life. The irony was that he was finally giving her the chance. The night rotation started 3 days later. Hannah's locker held the photograph she'd kept hidden for 8 years, Ramos at 23, grinning at the camera with his arm around her shoulders, the both of them standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter at Bagram, her captain's bars visible on her collar in that moment before the classified operation went sideways, before the 3 senators demanded it be buried. Before the colonel looked her in the eye and told her that Captain Hannah Clarke was no longer going to exist. She pulled her scrubs over that same body. tied her shoes with the muscle memory of someone who had tied them 1,000 times in the dark, clipped her badge to her collar and felt the weight of it like a brand. The ICU at night was a different animal than it was in daylight. The fluorescent lights buzzed differently, a higher pitch, as if the frequency changed after dark. The monitor alarms sounded lonelier. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm into corridors that had maybe 3 nurses for 30 patients, and Mercer had made sure she wasn't the one assigned to the critical cases. She was supposed to be cleaning rooms, processing discharges, work that required hands and eyes but not judgment, not authority, not the kind of presence that made people listen when she spoke. Ramos was in bed 7. She could see him from the hallway, intubated, sedated, his right arm resting on top of the blanket. She could see the tattoo from where she stood. Block letters. Hannah. A name he had carried into 3 tours and kept through everything that came after, and he still didn't recognize her when she walked past his room. That was what was waiting down the hallway. That was what Mercer had taken from her with 1 phone call and a reassignment form. The night shift supervisor, Janet, a woman who'd been neutral at best during the vending machine incident, found her at 2:22 a.m. standing in the med room counting antibiotics that didn't need counting. "I heard about the credentialing thing," Janet said quietly. Hannah didn't look up. "I also heard," Janet continued, "that you asked to pick up extra shifts in the units that don't need temporary credentialing clearance." "That's correct." "That's stupid," Janet said. "But it's also the hardest thing I've ever seen someone do." Hannah finally met her eyes. Janet was older, maybe 60, with the face of someone who had seen hospitals change and people stay the same. She held Hannah's gaze for 3 seconds. "Long enough." "Your patient in 7 is crashing," Janet said. "Not officially. But the blood gases are trending wrong. CO2 is climbing. If that pneumothorax develops again, and it will develop again, it's going to happen on my watch, and there's going to be exactly 3 people in this hospital who can fix it." The way she said it wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact delivered by someone who understood what it meant to watch competence get buried under institutional policy. "I understand," Hannah said. She didn't say, "I can't help him. I don't have clearance." She didn't say, "I'm trying to disappear." She didn't say any of the things that would have made sense to a normal person trying to survive. Instead, she went back to her room count and waited for the night to do what nights always do. She waited for the emergency to arrive. The shift started like any other until it didn't. Hannah moved through the ICU at Cedar Creek Medical with the practiced silence of someone who'd learned to be invisible, checking monitors, adjusting flow rates, counting the small mercies of a quiet night. Ramos lay in bed 7, his chest rising and falling in synchronization with the ventilator's mechanical wheeze. 3 days post-admission and still unconscious, his body healing while his mind remained somewhere distant, somewhere she couldn't reach even though she stood 6 feet away from him every 4 hours. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a blue-white pallor that made the monitors look like windows into another world. She was checking his O2 saturation, 94%, stable, when she noticed his breathing pattern change. Not obvious. Not the kind of thing that shows up on a monitor as a flashing red alert. But Hannah had spent 3 years at Cedar Creek and 12 years before that keeping people alive in conditions where there were no monitors at all, where pain was information and every subtle shift in breathing meant the difference between walking out and being carried out. She felt it the way a ship's captain feels a storm before the clouds break. Something was wrong. She called for the resident. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, still holding his coffee cup from the break room, his posture loose and untroubled. 28 years old, fresh out of residency, competent enough in stable situations but built for protocol, not crisis. She said quietly, his work of breathing just increased. "Listen to the breath sounds on the left." He leaned in. Listened. Set down his coffee. "Sounds fine to me." But her hand was already moving to the monitor, watching his oxygen saturation begin its slow descent. 94, 92. 88, the numbers didn't lie. She moved to the head of the bed to assess him properly, running her hands across his chest wall with the kind of certainty that comes from having done this in a sandstorm outside Kandahar with shrapnel falling like rain and nothing but field dressing supplies and muscle memory between a man and death. Tension pneumothorax. The air was collapsing his left lung, building pressure in his chest cavity, compressing his heart. Without intervention, cardiac arrest in minutes. We need to decompress. Now. She was already moving to grab the emergency kit, her voice having dropped into that register that military training installs in your bones, the one that sounds like a command even when it's framed as a statement. Dr. Chen was still standing there, processing, his brain moving through the differential diagnoses while the clock moved through the final seconds of available time. She didn't wait. She cleaned the skin at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her hands moving with a kind of fluid precision that comes from having already survived the worst. The 14-gauge angiocath needle was cool in her palm. She positioned it, angled slightly toward the foot of the bed, and pushed through skin and muscle and pleura. The hiss of air escaping, that sound like a tire going flat, was unmistakable in the sudden silence of the room. The relief was immediate. The needle served its purpose, a temporary decompression that would buy time for a chest tube, for the real intervention that would actually fix the problem. But the moment the air began to escape, his oxygen saturation climbed. 75, 82, 88, 92. Climbing. Stabilizing. Color returning to his face like someone pulling him back from the edge of an abyss. Dr. Chen's coffee sat forgotten on the bedside table. His eyes had gone wide in a way that said he'd finally understood what he was watching. Hannah was already moving toward the supplies for the tube, the one that would replace the emergency needle, the one that would actually solve this instead of just buying time. Her hands knew the steps. They'd always known the steps. Call chest tube set up to bed 7. Page the attending. She was speaking now, but to herself more than anyone else. Clinical. Precise. The vocabulary of someone who trained at a level that community colleges don't teach. Triage protocols. Field priorities. Evac timeline. The nurse tech in the doorway stopped moving. Dr. Chen's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like recognition, but not the kind that brought comfort. Someone had heard the terminology. Someone was noticing that the way she moved, the way she spoke, the absolute certainty in every gesture, none of it matched a nurse with a 2-year degree and 3 years at a hospital in Colorado Springs. Security footage would capture it all. The whole procedure. The needle going in with a kind of confidence that suggested she'd done this before, under conditions that weren't textbook. Multiple times. When it mattered most. Mercer had the footage by morning. Had already reviewed it twice before she clocked in, had already made his phone call to the credentialing committee, had already decided that what the footage showed, a nurse exceeding her scope of practice, performing a procedure that belonged exclusively to physicians, was exactly the weapon he needed. He was waiting for her at the nurse's station, her badge already in his hand. No anger in his voice. That was what made it worse. Just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the kind of satisfaction that comes from finally breaking something you've spent weeks trying to destroy. You're done. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out after you collect your personal items. Hannah stood very still. She didn't deny it. Didn't defend it. Didn't explain that the procedure she'd performed was identical to one she'd executed in a sandstorm outside Kandahar with Ramos bleeding out and 3 medevac helicopters circling like vultures, waiting for a window that would never come unless she created it herself. She didn't explain that Captain Hannah Clarke had saved 37 lives in Kandahar, had led her team through a classified operation that was supposed to secure an asset and instead went sideways in ways that made the Pentagon call emergency meetings and convinced 3 sitting senators that the entire operation needed to be buried so deep that even historians wouldn't find it. A colonel had looked her in the eye in a basement office at Bagram Airfield and told her that her service record would be erased, her rank dissolved, her existence as Captain Hannah Clarke officially terminated. For security. For plausible deniability. For reasons that were necessary and classified and absolutely final. She took the badge from Mercer's hand and nodded once. Didn't speak. Didn't rage. Didn't do anything but turn and walk to the locker room, pack the few things she'd kept there, a spare set of scrubs, a phone charger, the faded unit patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment that she'd sewn inside her jacket lining years ago, just small enough to fit against her ribs. At 3 a.m. she sat in an all-night diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the coffee was always hot and the waitress never asked questions. Her cup had gone cold an hour ago. She wasn't drinking it. She was staring at her reflection in the black window, watching the ghost of a woman who'd spent 3 years being invisible by choice and now found herself invisible by decree. No rank. No record. No official proof that Captain Hannah Clarke had ever existed at all. Just a nurse. Just a woman. Just someone staring at her own face and wondering who was looking back. The rain started without warning, hammering the parking lot like applause for a performance nobody was supposed to see. She pressed her hand against the window and felt the cold of the glass, felt the reality of the diner around her, and understood that some doors, once closed, don't open again. The badge hit the floor with a sound like a coin dropping into still water. Hannah didn't pick it up. Dr. Mercer stood at the doorway of the administrator's office, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and barely concealed contempt, the kind of look a man wore when he'd successfully eliminated a problem he'd been working toward since the moment she arrived at Cedar Creek Medical 3 years ago. The administrator handed her a manila envelope. Your final check. 2 weeks severance. Security will escort you to your locker. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Hannah nodded once and turned toward the hallway, her movements precise, economical, the way someone moves when they're already gone. The locker was a time capsule of a life that wasn't supposed to exist. She pulled out her stethoscope, her extra scrubs, the coffee thermos she'd carried through 100 shifts. At the bottom, wedged beneath a pair of compression socks, was the faded unit patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment, sewn inside an old jacket lining 3 years ago in a room in Kandahar where a colonel had told her that her service record would be erased, her rank dissolved, her existence as Captain Hannah Clarke officially terminated. She held it for exactly 7 seconds, then began placing everything into a cardboard box that smelled like old paper and forgotten things. The parking garage at 3 a.m. was empty except for her Subaru and the rain hammering down like a judgment. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, watching water streak the windshield. The box of belongings sat in the passenger seat. She was 38 years old with a 17-year-old son, $1,400 in her checking account, and a secret that had cost her everything. In the diner 3 blocks away, she ordered black coffee and sat in a booth facing the window. The coffee went cold. She stared at her reflection in the glass, a ghost of a woman who had carried 4 wounded soldiers across 2 kilometers under sustained mortar fire, who had held a dying Marine's hand while a medevac helicopter descended through smoke and dust, who had saved 37 lives that the Department of Defense would never officially acknowledge. The reflection stared back without recognition. Maybe they were right, she whispered to the empty booth. Maybe I never was anything but a nurse. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the unit patch. The stitching was loose. The colors had faded like old photographs. She turned it over in her hands, watching the overhead lights catch the thread, and for a moment she held it suspended over the coffee cup, fingers open, ready to let it fall into the liquid and watch it dissolve into nothing. The diner hummed around her. A tired waitress refilled someone's water. A man at the counter read a newspaper folded to the obituaries. And then she heard it, not from outside, but from inside the hospital 3 blocks away, from a patient whose name she wasn't supposed to know, whose vital signs she wasn't supposed to check, whose life she'd just saved by doing the only thing she knew how to do. Sergeant Ramos had opened his eyes. The phone in Cedar Creek Medical's ICU rang at 12:33 p.m. The day nurse answered on the second ring. The patient, John Doe, the unidentified trauma case, was awake. His oxygen saturation had improved. His pupil response was intact. And his first coherent words, spoken with a voice raw from intubation, were, "Where is she? Where is the nurse who saved me?" The hospital administrator, still riding the euphoria of terminating a problem employee, stood in the lobby near the information desk with Dr. Mercer, discussing paperwork. Security had just escorted Hannah out an hour earlier. Nobody knew that a 17-year-old boy in a grey hoodie had been sitting in the waiting room for the last 30 minutes, his backpack pressed against his chest like a shield. Marcus Clarke had driven to the hospital after school. His mother's phone had been dead for 2 days, not dead, he'd learned later, but turned off because she couldn't afford to pay the plan and couldn't bear to hear silence on the line. He'd found the medal case in the master bedroom closet, wedged behind a winter coat that hadn't been worn in 3 years. Inside were 3 decorations arranged on velvet, a bronze star with veiler, a silver star, and a purple heart with a second oak leaf cluster indicating a second wound. His hands had shaken as he packed them into his backpack. He didn't know the full story. His mother had told him years ago that she'd served a long time ago before nursing, but the details had been vague, redacted by the kind of secrecy that comes from orders never to speak about certain things. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: his mother didn't belong in a diner at 3 a.m. drinking cold coffee and considering erasing herself. He burst through the hospital lobby doors at noon with the kind of momentum only a scared 17-year-old can summon. The waiting room fell silent. He walked straight to the administrator's desk, found her standing with Dr. Mercer, and his voice cracked on the first word. "Mom. They need to see these." He opened his backpack with shaking hands and spilled the contents across the desk, not just the medals, but the citation papers that had been filed with them, the documentation that nobody had ever asked to see, the proof that lived in a locked box because proof was dangerous when your existence had been officially erased. Dr. Mercer's smile faltered. The administrator picked up the bronze star. "What is this?" "My mother's," Marcus said. "She was going to throw them away. She thought nobody cared. She thought," his voice broke. "She thinks she's nobody." The elderly patient in the wheelchair that had been waiting in the lobby for a cardiac consult leaned forward slightly. He was weathered, maybe 70, with hands that bore the kind of calluses that came from weapons and rope. He whispered 2 words, "Reaper 6." The sound traveled through the waiting room like a frequency only certain people could hear. 2 veteran orderlies froze. A hospital chaplain who'd served in the Marines in 2003 turned his head. A security guard in the corner, a former Navy corpsman, straightened up slowly. The name that had been buried for 5 years, the call sign that had been classified and then redacted and then classified again, had just been spoken aloud in a hospital lobby in Colorado Springs. A Marine orderly, someone Hannah had never met, someone who'd only heard the stories from other Marines about a captain who moved through villages like smoke and pulled out wounded soldiers under fire, stepped forward and picked up the silver star. His voice, when it came, carried the precise formality of someone reading scripture. "Captain Hannah Clarke. For gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Outstanding leadership and exceptional military judgment. Sustained fire from superior positions. Carried for wounded soldiers to safety. Refused evacuation until all personnel were accounted for." He paused, and when he continued, his voice broke. "Action saved the lives of 15 personnel. Recommended for valor above and beyond duty." The waiting room had gone so quiet that the fluorescent lights hummed like a frequency of shock. A man rose from a chair near the corridor, someone visiting a family member who'd seen him on the morning news, a 2-star general with 32 years in service and the kind of presence that made the air pressure in a room change. He didn't speak. He simply stood and raised his right hand in a slow, deliberate salute, not to Hannah, who wasn't even present, but to the decorations themselves, the formal acknowledgement of service beyond the ordinary measure of things. Dr. Mercer's face drained of color. He understood, in that moment, what he'd done. He understood that he'd spent 3 years slowly dismantling someone whose real credentials existed in places where his own authority meant nothing at all. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice tight. "We have protocols. This is not appropriate conduct in a medical facility. I'm going to need to." "Need to what?" The chaplain's voice came quietly. "Apologize?" The administrator's phone lit up. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. The voice on speaker was precise, military cadence, no introduction. This is the Pentagon calling to verify the operational status and current location of Captain Hannah Clarke. We have a medical situation that requires immediate confirmation. The line went silent except for the sound of breathing. Is she there? Hannah Clarke was sitting in a diner 3 blocks away, holding a faded unit patch and watching coffee go cold. But Marcus was there. And the elderly veteran in the wheelchair was there. And the Marine orderly was there with a silver star in his hand. And for the first time in 5 years, someone official, someone with authority that superseded hospital administrators and condescending surgeons and all the small calculated humiliations that had been designed to erase her, was asking for her by rank and name and the understanding that she had never stopped being what she'd always been, a soldier, a captain, someone whose value had never depended on anyone's belief. The waiting room held its breath. The administrators exchanged glances. And nobody said another word until Hannah Clarke walked through those doors, because she was about to be reminded that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. The hospital director's phone lit up on the mahogany desk. Washington, D.C. area code. His hand froze halfway to the receiver, and that single hesitation told Hannah everything. The room held its breath. Dr. Mercer's shoulders tightened. He knew. Somehow, he already knew. This is the Pentagon calling to verify the status of Operation Ghostlight operative Captain Hannah Clarke. The voice on speaker was measured, institutional, the kind of authority that didn't need to raise volume. We have a medical situation requiring her immediate consultation. The words fell like stones into still water. Captain. Not nurse. Captain. The administrator's face drained of color as his eyes snapped toward Hannah, still wearing yesterday's scrubs, still standing where security had ordered her to wait for final paperwork. Next to her, Marcus held the medal case against his chest like a hymnal. Dr. Mercer's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Within 30 minutes, a federal investigator walked into Cedar Creek Medical with a portable hard drive and questions. Within 2 hours, her investigation, the one Mercer had launched against Hannah to prove her incompetence, to document her the dangerous scope creep, to build the case that would keep her permanently barred from medicine, had been systematically redirected. The same security footage he'd weaponized against her now showed something else entirely. The angle captured his hand on the crash cart, his voice ordering the resident to delay the needle decompression by 7 minutes. Delayed, not because of protocol. Delayed because Hannah, the competent one, the one who made him look mediocre at rounds, had been the one standing there ready to do it. The investigator pulled 17 patient charts. Mercer's handwriting. Notes that didn't match imaging. A femur fracture documented as a hairline fracture, insurance code change meant a $4,600 difference in billing. That pattern repeated across 43 cases. 43. The math was insurance fraud layered over surgical negligence. A $847,000 gap between what happened and what he'd reported. One chart made the investigator pause. A patient who should have survived didn't. Wrong medication dose. Mercer's signature. The delay in documentation suggested he'd written it after the fact, trying to backfill a justification for a choice he'd made in the moment. Choice. That was the polite word for it. The hospital board convened at 2:15 p.m. They didn't fire Dr. Mercer. They couldn't. The federal government arrived with jurisdiction the same way Hannah had arrived in the ER, without warning, without negotiation, with the weight of something bigger than hospital policy. Within 4 hours, his medical license was suspended pending criminal review. By sunset, he'd been escorted from the building. Hannah was offered the position by 4:06 p.m. Director of Trauma Operations. Corner office. Salary that would make her son's college fund breathe easier. She said yes to the office. She said no to leaving the floor. I want to work bedside, she told the board. That's where I've always needed to be. 6 months later, a photo hung on the wall of that office anyway. Sergeant Ramos is awake now, solid in the ICU chair by the window, his hand resting over the tattoo on his left arm. Her name? Hannah. Still there in military block letters, the ink faded by time and scar tissue, but unmistakable. He was smiling. Not the drugged smile of sedation. The real one. The one that reached his eyes because those eyes now recognized her. She stood beside his bed in the photograph, her uniform jacket over scrubs, captain's bars visible on her collar. Not hidden. Not erased. Exactly where they'd always belonged. Dr. Mercer taught CPR basics now. Pikes Peak Community College, the strip mall location where the rent was cheapest and the student body turned over every 8 weeks. $16 an hour. His name tag read Steve because somewhere in the administrative paperwork, someone with a sense of irony had decided his formal title wasn't necessary anymore. He taught chest compressions to EMT trainees and insurance adjusters taking mandatory recertification courses. His hand showed them the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Push hard, push fast. The standard he'd violated 37 times. The fluorescent lights in that community college classroom buzzed with the same frequency as the ones at Cedar Creek. But Mercer flinched when anyone called him doctor now. His voice came out smaller. He wore the name tag like a collar. The trembling wasn't his fear. It was restraint, the restraint of every person who'd ever worked under him, every colleague who'd known and said nothing, every patient chart that didn't match what actually happened. All of that restraint, finally released, finally bearing weight. Hannah kept the photo on her office wall not as revenge. As truth. As a reminder of why she'd never left bedside work, never chased title, never believed that competence needed permission to exist. Ramos recovered. Released from Cedar Creek after 8 weeks, he came back for physical therapy twice a week, and every time he saw Hannah, he saluted. Not the formal kind. The small one. The one that meant I remember. I know what you did. The Pentagon called again. Not for Hannah. For the hospital. Operation Ghostlight was being declassified in parts. The stories could finally surface. Hannah Clarke's name could finally appear in official records, 37 lives saved in Kandahar, 2024 still the year she'd carried for wounded under mortar fire, 12 years the span of her service before it was erased. Before it was restored. Veterans began arriving at Cedar Creek Medical specifically requesting her. Word spread through the VA system, then through military channels. A nurse who understood. A nurse who'd been there. The hospital opened a dedicated wing for veteran care within 9 months. Hannah ran it. She hired 2 former combat medics and a Navy SEAL who transitioned into nursing. She created protocols for patients with classified histories, for the ones who couldn't explain their injuries because the operations didn't officially happen. For the ones wearing erased lives. The calls kept coming. From the Pentagon. From military families. From other hospitals asking how she'd done it, how she'd stayed in the work after everything tried to push her out. Her answer was always the same. Someone had to remember them when nobody else could. I became a nurse because I couldn't carry weapons anymore. But these hands can still do something that matters. On a Thursday morning in November, she was checking vitals on a post-op patient when a young woman appeared in the doorway. Early 20s, hesitant, wearing the expression of someone looking for something they might not find. Hannah knew that look. "You're the nurse," the woman said. "The one from the story." Hannah set down her blood pressure cuff. "Which story?" "The one about Kandahar. My father, Sergeant Ramos, he told me you saved his life. He said you'd been invisible for so long that when they finally saw you again, everyone had to stop and remember who you actually were." Hannah didn't respond right away. She finished the vital sign, documented it in the chart, and when she looked back at the woman, her eyes were clear. Not tearful. Not soft. Just present. "Your father's a good man. You should listen to him." The woman nodded and left. Hannah returned to her rounds. Patient in 412 needed labs drawn. Patient in 414 was asking about discharge. Patient info 16 was a former Marine with PTSD and no one else was trained to. She moved toward 416. The work was endless. The work was everything. The work was why she'd chosen to keep walking into Cedar Creek Medical every single day, even when Cedar Creek Medical had tried to erase her. Even when Dr. Mercer, now somewhere in a community college classroom, had tried to prove she didn't belong. She belonged. Not because the Pentagon said so. Not because medals hung in a frame or a title sat on a paycheck stub. She belonged because competence, quiet and relentless and proven through 7,000 patient interactions, carved its own path. It just took the world a little longer to see it. By 11:22 a.m., she'd completed rounds on 12 patients. By lunch, she was back in the trauma bay reviewing protocols. By 3:38 p.m., she was teaching a nursing student how to catch the subtle shift in a patient's breathing pattern that meant something was going wrong before any monitor would scream. This was the work. Bedside. Unglamorous. Absolutely essential. And hers to own completely. The quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. Did you ever work somewhere that didn't see your value until someone else had to point it out? Leave a comment. And if you want more stories about the ones doing the work nobody recognizes, subscribe. Because there are more Hannahs out there. More stories that need to be told. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss them.